American Literature and Addiction as a Brain Disease by Angela, Kira, and Nicole. Drinking is common in America. It's the norm for many people and many events, from drinking to celebrate the birth of children to being able to mourn the deaths of loved ones. People find many different reasons to incorporate drinking. Caroline Knapp describes in Drinking: A Love Story her love and passion, sensual pleasures, deep pulls, but she also describes sufferings, the lust, fears, and yearning hungers for alcohol. A drinking addiction affects family, friends, partners, co-workers, and employers. According to the medicaldaily.com, people have been drinking for at least 11,000 years. Therefore, it's not a new addiction. My stepfather started off on his day off, drinking excessively 1 day a week. It didn't seem to be a problem to us kids because that was the day of fun for us. We knew that we were able to do whatever we wanted so long as we let him know where we were going, and we knew we had to be home before nightfall. My mother, on the other hand, would have to go to work to help support the household income, and she would worry about us 3 kids. We ranged from 4 to 10 years old. With the Thursday night drinking and drugging parties, my mother would come home from work at midnight to a house that was destroyed due to the parties, and she was left always cleaning up the mess. She would be justifiably upset and would stress her anger to my stepfather, therefore it would change his mood to being very aggressive. In the story Bringing Belle Home by Bonnie Jo Campbell, Belle unfortunately was raised and had suffered from the aggressive and abusive acts of her father, whereas I witnessed the aggression and abuse that was inflicted to my mother. The aggression and fighting would put stress on their relationship, and sometimes the police were called, and he would be arrested. What I didn't understand as a child was how his drinking really affected our lives. The household income loss must have been an outstanding amount of debt accumulated due to bailing him out of jail, his missed work, and his court costs. Household repair due to the drinking rage destruction, not including the medical expenses my mother acquired for her inability to cope with the undue stress. My dad, on the other hand, drank most of my life due to the inability to cope with pain that occurred due to severe car accident. When all other painkillers stopped working, he decided to just start drinking because it worked. In the story Big Blonde by Dorothy Parker, after the failed suicide due to deep depression, she decides to just keep drinking as if it was her only option. In Bringing Belle Home, Thompson sat in a bar as if he was a regular. He knew the bartender, and I would assume some of the regular customers. My dad is that way. He knows most of the customers and all the bartenders because he drank every day, after work, until the pain was muted. Although he never became aggressive, on the other hand, he was very playful. All of my friends loved my dad because he was so much fun. Unfortunately, now, 40 years later, his organs aren't functioning the way they should had he not drank most of his life. The effects of a drinking addiction included, but not limited to, sadness, anxiety, depression, diminished motor functions, hostility or anger, destructiveness, and preventable incidents. Pete Hamill, in A Drinking Life, describes that drinking was helping him escape pain and boredom. When sobering up, he experienced pain, boredom, trembling hands, legs twitching, or morning leg numbness, and even misspelled words. Consequences include, but not limited to, could be incarceration and or hospitalization, inability to function. One could lose relationships, must repair anything that was destroyed due to the destructive behavior. According to www.drug-rehab.org, moderation is key to alcohol prevention. The typical adult male can handle about 2 drinks per day, and the female can handle 1 drink per day without qualifying as an addict. Things that you could do to not become addicted is to not overdrink, especially not on a regular basis. You could consider not overdrinking when you have school, work, or other responsibilities for the next day, excluding special occasions, of course. And drinking at the end of the day to wind down instead of drinking throughout the day are things that you could do to prevent addiction. According to Dr. Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, on www.medicineplus.gov, she states that an addiction is a disease, a treatable disease, and it needs to be understood. They also state that currently addiction affects 23.2 million Americans, of whom only about 10% were receiving the treatment they need. Causes of brain disease in the brain can be temporary changes, and according to the drugabuse.gov, it is a central nervous system depressant that is rapidly absorbed from the stomach and small intestine into the bloodstream. Intoxication can impair brain function and motor skills, and heavy use can increase the certain risks of certain cancers, stroke, and liver disease. Permanent changes, according to the HBO.com/addiction, states that prolonged excessive alcohol use, for example, is believed to cause pervasive alterations in the brain stress and anti-stress systems. These changes in and of themselves may lead to additional compulsive drinking. Addictions happen when the brain changes. For example, as the dopamine levels increase, the serotonin levels decrease. Aristotle believed in akrasia, that we could be impetuous by pleasure or by anger, or weakness by pleasure or by anger, depending on our mental status.
I feel I have a very broad understanding of drug addiction because of my personal experiences. My dad has battled with his addiction to drugs and alcohol ever since I can remember. His addiction started from years of alcoholism. Drinking always exposed the dilutive flaws of his character. His drinking led to an addiction of gambling and the drug cocaine. Once my dad started to get really involved with cocaine, his life spiraled out of control. His drug progression took place when I was younger, so I was unaware of his abuse. Although I was young, I still did notice his unhealthy behaviors, and as I started to grow up, I really figured it out for myself. Because of drugs, my dad has lost his business, his wife, his kids, his friends, and the motivation to give back to the world. Even though he has lost so much, he still is in a delusional state of denial. Unfortunately, I have seen the pain of addiction, and I will see it even more. My father is stuck in a narcissistic lifestyle, and I believe he will never change. When it comes to addiction, someone cannot defeat their addiction without extreme amount of willpower and action. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts, because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. So more negative effects of drug addiction happen with losing their job, failing in school, self-worth, sensitivity, and relationships. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe effects of drug addiction. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. An addictive personality that serves as that one to get hooked on experience. Many people committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drugs. Someone you love because drugs are addicted. That answer is not easy to come to. When a close family member is in that type of situation to support relationships, bad habit, and family. The view of very common of a family member, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. And I think lastly, the most severe, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. This happens in the short story. Feels like they cannot relate to anyone. The narrator believes his son, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. Overhears his wife and son talking more negative effects and having a nice of drug addiction. At this moment, he realizes his son will not speak in front of him. Losing their job, they have a strained relationship due to self-worth, sensitivity, and stressful behavior that he inflicts on the family. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe friends. You lose friends and you make some. Although not good people come out of this. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational, and that is not healthy for you. We see this aspect of addiction along with friends, even coworkers. You present yourself grabs his companion as someone who is less trustworthy, less responsible, and more of a liability than on-edge feeling that this causes you to have a strained committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts because drugs change the person you are, and it is very apparent to others. It does not only affect you, but it affects everyone around you. To support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. So more negative effects of drug addiction happen with losing their job, failing in school, self-worth, sensitivity, and relationships. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe effects of drug addiction. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. So more negative effects of drug addiction happen with losing their job, failing in school, self-worth, sensitivity, and relationships. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe effects of drug addiction. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. So more negative effects of drug addiction happen with losing their job, failing in school, self-worth, sensitivity, and relationships. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe effects of drug addiction. And there is a difficult time feeling pleasure. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else. Repeated drug exposure changes them even closer to the drug. This causes someone to feel like they need a drug to survive. More negative effects. When someone becomes sober without a drug for a long period of time and then goes back to the drug, it's called a job, failing in school. This happens very often. Self-worth, sensitivity, usually relapse is a huge signal for the need to return to treatment. Even though relapse is very common, it is still common too. Relapse not only drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts, because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs. Lastly, a huge signal of addiction is isolation. An addict feels like they cannot relate to anyone else, finds himself, and it causes them to become even closer to the drug. Doesn't even want to because he feels powerless. More negative effects of drug addiction, and that's why they tend to relapse. Relapse has such dramatic effects because it takes the person back to that dark place and maybe even into relationships. I believe relationships are one of the most sad and severe effects of drug addiction. An even worse image of addiction. Drug addiction leads to changes in one's behavior. An addict tends to act irrational and erratic. We see this aspect of addiction in the short story Back Teen, when the narrator grabs his companion from across the table and chokes him at the diner. This exhibits that on-edge feeling that addicts experience. Committing criminal activity is inevitable when it comes to drug addicts, because drugs are illegal. And Bust, the main character under his drug addiction, commits robberies to support his bad habit and family. This is very common in drug addicts, especially when addicts are addicted to harder drugs.